I want to say hello to everyone and welcome to our first event of 2021. I believe you can say Happy New Year for the whole month of January, and it's been quite a month. So Happy New Year, and very excited to welcome everyone. I'm Karen Davidov. I'm founder of the Jewelry Library. We are located at 1239 Broadway between 30 and 31st Street in New York City, though our space is closed at the moment. We are a collaborative space for jewelry people, and we offer a wide range of exhibitions, talks, and events all across the jewelry spectrum, collaborating with both contemporary and vintage galleries, artists and collectors, as well as storytellers, historians, makers, and wearers. And tonight we are excited to bring back our Jewelry Detective series with the mystery of the Indian necklace for all those Nancy Drew aficionados in the audience. I'm certainly one. So recently I was reading one of our new book acquisitions, Kadri Malik's Hunt. She's an Estonian jeweler and professor of jewelry. And there's an essay in the book by the Dutch jewelry historian, Lisbeth den Besten, who writes, "Jewelry, because of its history, tradition, materiality, and connectedness to people, has a capacity that few other things have, namely the capacity to transmit personal stories and forge contacts between people. A piece of jewelry can be restored, changed, beautified, and extended without losing the stories. On the contrary, every deed of restoration, conservation, and improvement adds to the story of the piece as an entity that gathers narratives. Every new owner of a piece adds his story to it." I love that quote, and I thought it was a great introduction to tonight's talk because we're going to be hearing from Jan Krulick-Belin, museum educator, art consultant, and art and jewelry historian, about an 1840s Indian necklace that she acquired at an auction a number of years ago. Jan is going to take us through the steps she follows and followed with this necklace in the process of discovering the stories hidden within. We're going to learn how to look, which is what Jan has been teaching museum goers for decades, and we'll be able to take some of her jewelry detective techniques back to our own jewelry boxes. We'll have some time for questions at the end, and if you have one, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A. We will find them. I'll look in both places. Let me introduce Jan. Jan Krulick-Belin has more than 40 years experience at institutions, including the Corcoran Gallery of Art, Denver Art Museum, Beaumont, Texas Art Museum, and the Smithsonian. Retired as Director of Education for the Phoenix Art Museum, she continues to work with museums, arts organizations, and private collections. She's also the author of the award-winning book, Love, Bill, Finding My Father Through Letters from World War II. She grew up in New York City and currently resides in Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Karen. Can everyone hear me? I'm so happy to be here tonight. This is exciting. When Karen and I first talked about this idea, I think it was last summer, we kind of thought about the topic and how best to dive into it. And I thought about this particular necklace that I'm going to be talking about tonight that actually I'm wearing right now. As really a good way to learn the way that I approach an object, a piece of jewelry, and the way that I've been trained to look at any object. And because we're talking about being a jewelry detective tonight, I've brought my requisite spyglass with me and my loupe. Can't do without that. And from there, I think I'll dive into it, and we'll hopefully have some questions and conversation at the end of all of this. So to get started, I think as a jewelry detective, let's see if I can. My spyglass actually has 3 lenses that I metaphorically use to study each and every piece of jewelry that I look at. First of all, I look at a piece of jewelry through the lens of a museum educator. As Karen said, that's what I spent the majority of my professional career being, as a museum educator. And in that context, everything I did was based on this notion of what we used to call the centrality of the artifact. Or in other words, the notion that a wealth of stories can radiate out of one single object. And it could be anything. It could be out of this spyglass and it's made of wood. I can talk about forestry or a piece of glass and optics. I mean, you can come up with a whole range of topics just basically from one object, whether it's a fine object or an everyday object. Now, sometimes those stories follow separate paths and take you in different directions, and sometimes they intersect. But in the end, they all inform our looking experience. And as Karen said, as a museum educator, it was my job to teach people how to look and how to incorporate all those stories that either they discover themselves or that we give them in terms of the information that we provide, and put all of that together and come up with a greater understanding of that object. My second lens is that of an art historian. I was taught how to uncover those stories through research. And as the Renaissance art scholar Bernard Berenson said, who you see here looking through his magnifying spyglass at a painting, he said, we need to call upon what he called the intelligent eye. In other words, use the power of observation and the ability to call upon one's visual file cabinet, this cabinet of images that we amass over a lifetime in order to piece together all of the clues. And really that notion of the intelligent eye is the word connoisseurship, and it can apply to an art object or a piece of jewelry. It's just literally looking carefully, calling upon our memory, all of the things that we've seen, and put all that information together. And finally, as a jewelry historian, I approach each piece of jewelry the same way I would a painting or another art object. And it's really like peeling back the layers of an onion to reveal its secrets. Each piece of jewelry is a storybook. And in the quote that Karen opened up this evening's session with, it's true that all of the people who owned the piece, all of the stories that went with, whether the object is changed or comes down through history untouched, all of those stories build and layer upon the other. And often the older the piece, the more stories there are to be uncovered and read. Now, this process of discovery can be divided into 4 major stages of inquiry. The first one is really just basic description. And it's what can you see? What is it when you look at that object that you can see without any other extraneous information? Is it a brooch? Is it a ring? Could it have been both? Could it have been changed? Is it gold? Is it silver? What stones are there? Same thing in a painting. Is it oil? Is it acrylic? Is it something else? Is it another medium combined or a collage? So it's what you can physically see. Is it signed in the front or signed in the back? And that's really important, even with an art object or particularly a piece of jewelry. A lot of the information and the things that you can see are actually on the back of the piece. If you look at the back of a piece of jewelry, you could hopefully find either the hallmark or the maker or signature, or you can look at the type of clasp on a brooch, and based on the type of clasp, because we know certain clasps were invented at different times, you can figure out maybe the date. Or does it say 14 karat, 18 karat, 22 karat? All of these things are things that you can see with your eye without even going any further. In a painting, it's something similar. Lots of times you turn over a canvas and you can see stickers on it or labels. We can learn how many museums own the piece. Sometimes when it's displayed at an exhibition, a sticker is put on the back of that. So you get a whole, a lot of information about that particular painting as well. And the last 3 stages of inquiry actually are more the research and information gathering. So the second one would be the object's historical and cultural context. The third would be the object's provenance, or who owned it, When? How did it get from point A to point B? How did it get from 1840 to today? And then the last stage, which is sometimes the trickiest, is its meaning or symbolic content. Sometimes in a painting, we talk about the symbolism or the iconography, particularly in a medieval or a Renaissance piece, where there were hidden messages that were placed within that particular painting. And when I say hidden, to us they're hidden, but people who lived at the time knew what a lot of those objects meant, whether it was a particular flower or a particular symbol for Christ or whatever. And so you have the symbolic content in jewelry, let's say during the Victorian era. If you see a brooch that has pansies all over it, those flowers had deep meaning, and people understood what the pansy meant and what that sentiment for that jewel would mean. And it's the other layer that paintings might not have that I think makes jewelry so special. And what, again, Karen alluded to in the introduction today, is that jewelry tends to carry an emotional layer, a sentimental layer, whether the piece was acquired for a special occasion or given by somebody special, whether it was a wedding gift. All of those things and the emotions that were attached to that piece of jewelry, whether you inherited it from an important relative, all of those things adds that next layer of understanding. So some of these stories and these things that we uncover through these stages of inquiry are more clearly written for us, while others are harder to decipher, especially when a piece is older. And unfortunately, as jewels change hands over the generations, which antique jewelry, of course, does, the stories are not transmitted along with a piece of jewelry. And that's the sad part. I know that every time I look at an antique piece of jewelry or I decide I love it and have to have it, in the back of my mind, I'm always wondering who had it before me, who loved it, who wore it. And I think there of a quote that Elizabeth Taylor said about her jewelry collection was that we're really only temporary custodians of our jewelry, and it's our turn to take care of it, but then pass it on to the next person who hopefully will love it as much or more than we did. And that's where the detective work comes in. We're here to solve cases, solve the mysteries that time has erased. And this is the part that I love to do. This is the fun part, is the research part, and kind of have that aha moment if you find a factoid that is going to help you learn more about that piece. So in tonight's short chat, what I'd like to do is focus on one of my own jewels to illustrate this detective process of mine. And I'm showing you this particular Indian necklace that we're going to talk about tonight. It was purchased in 2006 from a London auction house. And because it was sold through an auction, there was already some information in the accompanying auction catalog, but it was so clear to me that much more information needed to be unearthed. So let's begin with the first story and the first stage of this process of inquiry. The basics. What can you see? Well, the catalog description already tells a lot about what I could see with my own eye. And it says, quote, a 19th century painted miniature necklace and brooch. The necklace composed of 10 glazed circular painted miniatures of important Indian architectural views. Each is mounted in a gold cannetille mount to a ribbon tie, and a matching panel later mounted as a brooch. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you're not familiar with the cannetille technique with gold, it's almost like little beehives. They're three-dimensional, little scrolling beehives with little dots on top of them, or little granulations on top. Now, as far as the materials and manufacture go with this necklace, I can look at it carefully under a loupe, I can turn it over, but there are no marks and there's no mention of the gold content. I can only use the logic and look at other like pieces of jewelry for comparison's sake. So I'm left to assume it's probably 22 karat gold. I've yet to have it tested, and I probably should. And I base that on the color of gold. If you've seen enough gold, sometimes it's easy to tell the difference between very high content gold, like 22, 24 karat gold is much brighter, much yellower, versus 14 karat gold, let's say, or obviously white gold. And its country of origin based on the imagery, but also if I compare it to other Indian jewelry, here's some contemporary pieces, that, you know, the workmanship and the style and the type of work and the color of the gold is very similar to what's done in India today. So again, I can kind of know all of that just by using my eye, or as Bernard Berenson says, the intelligent eye. And I can also focus on the imagery, the context, and the provenance, which I'll get to in just a bit. Which, as I said, so I learn enough about it. It's gold, it has glazed panels. If I knew at the time that I bought the necklace that the fact that it just said glazed panels, it didn't say anything about ivory content, which I'll get to later on down the line, that would have probably solved a lot of issues for me. But I wasn't as familiar with this type of jewelry, so it was all new to me. The next stories that we'll be looking at deal with that research and information gathering stages. And it involves understanding the historical and artistic context for this necklace and this type of jewelry, which is actually connected, I found in my research, to the British East India Company. That was a private company, which after a long series of wars and diplomatic efforts came to rule India eventually by the 19th century. The company was chartered by Queen Elizabeth I on December 31st, 1600. And the original company comprised of a group of London merchants who hoped to trade for spices in present-day Indonesia. After a series of conflicts with the Dutch and Portuguese traders who were active in the Spice Islands at the time, the East India Company concentrated its efforts on trading on the Indian subcontinent. In the early 1600s, the company began dealing with the Mughal emperors of India. English traders set up outposts in what would become the cities of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, their earlier, older names. And numerous products, including silk, cotton, sugar, tea, and opium, began to be exported out of India. And in return, English goods that included wool, silver, and other metals were shipped to India. The other thing that was traded, of course, were jewels. But I won't get into that right now with my particular necklace. In 1833, the Government of India Act passed by the British Parliament actually ended the company's trading and or running their business that they had for centuries. And eventually the company would become the de facto government of India under colonial rule. So when the company expanded into South Asia during the late 1700s, a great number of its employees actually moved from England and carved out new lives for themselves in India. And they were fascinated by its exotic flora and fauna, its ancient monuments, and quote, its exotic people. And Karen and I talked a little bit about early this on, you know, we're not going to get too deep into talking about colonialism and sort of appropriation. But there is that element, of course, when you look at art objects from this time period, where you have people from England coming, and of course, this new land that they control, everything is foreign and different, and they're fascinated by that, and it almost becomes a commodity in and of itself. And they were very anxious to capture all these images that they were seeing to send home to people who were still living back in England, but also to keep for themselves as souvenirs. So of course, before photography, they hired Indian painters to do that job. The paintings that resulted were done in a sort of a hybrid style of European and Indian painting styles and color palettes that were known as what we call company paintings. Using watercolor on paper or gouache on ivory and glass, these artists created sets of standard popular subjects that could be sold to any tourist passing through the major attractions at the time, as well as the British people who are now living there. Common subjects were the residences that they lived in, their servants, carriages, horses, other exotic animals like elephants, and other possessions that the company employees had now amassed. Other paintings depicted festivals, the Indian people and its caste system, occupations, and the costumes that they were finding on the subcontinent. Its magnificent Mughal rulers and architectural monuments were also the most popular subjects that they collected. Now, company paintings I found were mostly intended to be kept in portfolios or in albums and shared. However, a large quantity of jewelry was produced, including framed portraits, miniatures, and mounted architectural scenes like these, and the ones that are very similar to my necklace, which is in the center of the screen. What's interesting is, and the time period coincides actually with the type of souvenir jewels that people were buying when they were doing the grand tour in the 19th century on the continent and in Italy. And they were collecting things like these micro mosaics that were on the left screen, or what we call pietra dura or hardstone mosaic jewelry, which were done in Florence, the micro mosaics done in Rome. So these things were very, very common. They were collected, as I said, when people were going through Europe, just the same way that people living on the Indian continent, or at that time also touring and traveling through India, were picking up. So of course, I was now curious to know which monuments were represented in my necklace. But because the catalog only identified 3 of the 10 included architectural sites, I was left with another detective hunt on my hands. In looking at the necklace and the 3 that were already identified in the sale catalog, of course, was the Taj Mahal, which probably I would have been able to identify very easily without much research, or the Red Fort in Delhi. And the 3rd one was the Golden Temple at Amritsar. And, you know, when looking at the paintings, you can imagine, given the small size, I mean, if you're looking at the size on my neck of each little individual painting, it's very small, and the quality of the paintings are quite meticulous and wonderful, enough to really be able to look at and compare it to an actual photograph. But over time, I've been able to identify most of the remaining miniatures by matching them to photos of Indian monuments that I could find in books or on the internet, or similar pieces of jewelry that I was able to find, again, on the internet or through other searches in books. So in this case, this particular painting is of the Juma Masjid in Delhi. Although the actual view in my necklace is from the side view. So if you took the photograph and rotated it 90 degrees, you would be able to come in through the side entrance of the building, and that's the view that's painted. Or the Qutb Minar, this tall, slender monument. The Diwani Khas at the Red Fort in Delhi, which was sort of the throne room. Or the Pearl Mosque, again at the Red Fort in Delhi. And finally, the Tughlaqabad Fort, also in Delhi. And the last one I haven't been able to find or locate because it's so generic that it's really hard to pinpoint. So that's sort of part of the research of just trying to figure out the images on my necklace, and that it took quite a number of months to actually just pour through, you know, photography books and on the internet. So again, that's just a little bit about the background that I had to go to in researching the context of these company paintings and the production of them in India. The final and perhaps most complex case to solve revolves around the necklace's provenance. According to the catalog, quote, the necklace was formerly in the collection of a gentleman named Charles Brooke, second Raja of Sarawak, and his wife, Margaret de Wint. Now, Raja, I knew that word as sort of some type of ruler of India, but I wasn't aware of an Englishman with the title of Raja, and I certainly wasn't that familiar with Sarawak. Now, I was fascinated to think that this woman, Margaret de Wint, who was a Rane, or a queen of Sarawak, so to speak, or princess, had my necklace once upon a time and actually wore it. And I thought, great, my necklace was on the neck of a queen and royalty. But then I was left with the question, who were these people and what might I be able to find out about them? So there again was another dive into unfamiliar areas of geography and history. I didn't know much about Sarawak, so I had to look that up. Sarawak, I learned, is the largest among the 13 states of Malaysia, and it's located in northwest Borneo Island. It's bordered by the state of Sabah to the northeast and Brunei to the north. The Bruneian Empire was established in the coastal regions of Sarawak by the mid-15th century. The 16th century saw the birth of the Sultanate of Sarawak, a local kingdom that lasted for almost half a century before being reunited with Brunei in 1641. And by the 19th century, the Bruneian Empire was in sad decline until the discovery of antimony ore. Increasing antimony production led the Brunei Sultanate to demand higher taxes of its citizens, which ultimately led to civil unrest. So in 1839, the Sultan requested the aid of a British sailor and mighty adventurer named James Brooke. And he happened to be doing trade back and forth in Malaysia, and he seemed to be somebody who was very competent, and he somehow came in contact with the Sultan of Brunei, who asked him to help subdue the revolt of its citizens, which he subsequently did. And he was very generously rewarded with more antimony ore, which apparently was very highly prized, with property, and eventually with the governorship of Sarawak itself. Brooke was then awarded the title of the first Raja of Sarawak in 1842. This British family was left to rule Sarawak for the next 100 years, and they were called the famous White Rajas of Sarawak. They were accorded a status similar to that of the rulers of Indian princely states, and under James's rule, the region experienced considerable prosperity. But when James died, unmarried and childless in 1868, his nephew Charles Johnson Brooke, the once owner of my necklace, as I said earlier, became the second Raja of Sarawak, and he ruled the territory until 1917. Sarawak became a British protectorate in 1888, and Charles Viner Brooke, who was the son of Charles, followed in his father's footsteps in 1917. But after World War II, he couldn't afford to rebuild after the Japanese invasion of the island. So finally, he ceded Sarawak to Great Britain in 1946. Now, shortly after becoming the Raja, the second Raja, Charles traveled back to England with the intention of marrying his recently widowed second cousin, Elizabeth Sarah Johnson. But he actually wound up marrying and proposing to her daughter, Margaret de Vint. Now, Margaret was born on October 9, 1849 in Paris. She spent her early years in France with her parents and great-grandmother, the Baroness de Vint. In 1859, fearing political situations arising in France, the family moved to England. Margaret and Charles were married in October 1869, and she was 20 years old, and Charles was 40, so there was a large age gap. Consequently, Margaret became the Rane, or the Queen of Sarawak. She was described as tall, fair, good-looking, intelligent, and she was a very talented pianist. They moved to the island of Sarawak in 1870, where their first 3 children would be born. She apparently embraced her new role and her new country and its people, and used her unique position to break down local taboos. She advocated for women's rights and universal education. She even composed the national anthem of Sarawak in 1872. But she didn't find her marriage an easy one, and Charles was extremely frugal, and he never really appreciated her talents. When both her relationship with him and her health deteriorated, she decided to return to London. Unfortunately, on the return voyage through the Red Sea in September 1873, all 3 of her children died of cholera while on board. She would eventually return to Sarawak, where they had 3 more sons who survived into adulthood. And as I said, Charles, the middle one, would eventually take over being the next Raja. But the conflict over money continued and her health problems returned. So from the early 1880s, the couple were once again estranged and led separate lives. He staying in Sarawak, she back in London. Now, her title of Rane, which was an unusual status as an Asian monarch, gave her a very good position in London society, and through it, she actually brought prestige to Sarawak itself. She was at the center of social circles that included several of the leading literary talents of the 1890s, like Oscar Wilde and Henry James. And actually, one of Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, The Young King, was dedicated to Margaret. Margaret's last visit to Sarawak was in 1895 when the Rajah was not present. She eventually, this is her back in London, and she eventually published her memoir, My Life in Sarawak in 1913, and later Impromptus and Good Morning and Good Night in 1934, which, by the way, I did read again in my dive to understand who this woman was who wore my necklace, and wondering maybe if mention of the necklace would ever appear in there, which unfortunately it did not. When she moved back to London, she was left to raise her 3 boys basically by herself, and she wanted to give them a good education, so she wound up pawning an impressive diamond known as the Star of Sarawak, which was 70 carats. It was from Borneo, and apparently Charles purchased it from a Chinese merchant in 1870. I did try to find more about this famous diamond known as the Star of Sarawak, and unfortunately, I have not been able to find anything. The stone apparently was displayed in London, possibly around the time of its sale by Margaret. And as I said, unfortunately, its current, its history or what happened to it after that is unknown, or at least I haven't been able to find anything. Now, Margaret arranged for the marriages of her sons by organizing social events for the British aristocracy, thereby introducing her boys to the daughters of British nobility. And actually, she became legendary during her lifetime, was very well known, and died at the ripe old age of 87 in 1936. Now, one thing that Karen and I talked about and laughed about was, as I said, sometimes these stories take you in very unexpected directions. And there's a little aside I just have to bring up, because I just found out that a Hollywood film titled Raja is currently in production. It was supposed to be released last year, but now it's slated to be released in 2021. And though it seems to be primarily based on the first Raja, James Brooke, who will be played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, I doubt Charles and Margaret will appear in the movie, but you never know. I'm hoping maybe there'll be something in there. And the idea of actually making this film goes back as far as 1936, the year that Margaret died. And because it was then that Errol Flynn had written a script about this story, but obviously it never went into production. So the big questions still remain for me. How did an 1840 necklace, which we're assuming is an 1840, it's what the catalog said it was from. A lot of similar necklaces range from 1825 to 1850s. However, necklaces of this type were made through the 19th century. But how did it get from India eventually to an auction house in London in the year 2006? There's also a 30 to 40 year gap between the supposed making of the necklace, perhaps in 1840, and its possible acquisition by Charles and Margaret. And then there's a 70-year time span between their deaths and its appearance in a London auction house. So how do you explain these holes, and how do you fill these gaps? So there's multiple possibilities I've come up with. First, we do know that the first Raja, James Brooke, was born in a suburb of Benares, India in 1803, because his father, Thomas, was an English judge at the Court of Appeals in British-run India. At age 12, James was sent to England for his education, but he returned to India in 1819 as an ensign in the Bengal Army of the British East India Company. So now we know he had connections to both India and the British East India Company. In 1830, he moved back to Madras, and we know that Madras in India was a center for making this type of jewelry and these company paintings. And between 1834 and 1838, he had made 2 journeys to the Malaysian archipelago, and as I said, would eventually become the Raja of Sarawak. Question is, could James have purchased the necklace in India around it when it was created? But we know that he never married. If he bought it, who would he have bought it for if he wasn't married? And if he did own it, could he have passed it down to his nephew Charles, the next Raja? We don't know. We know that Charles served in the Royal Navy, and during his service, he was involved in numerous military actions throughout Asia, Africa, and the South China Seas. He entered the service of his uncle James in 1852 and began as resident at the Lundu station in Sarawak, kind of almost working for his uncle before becoming the Raja. Might he have picked up the necklace on any of his own journeys? Was it a gift specifically for Margaret? And when was it given and why? Again, if he didn't get it from his uncle Charles, did he buy it himself? Might it have been something that Charles or Margaret picked up together during their trips between Sarawak and London? And we know there were several. According to snippets from Margaret's memoir and the standard ship routes that we know about at the time, the route from London to Sarawak and vice versa was pretty standardized. Somebody would leave London here, make their way to Marseille through the Mediterranean Sea, and after 1869, when the Suez Canal opened, they would pass through the canal, through the Red Sea. They would pass Aden, Yemen, down here. Then they would move on to the main ports in India, Bombay or Mumbai today, work their way down the coastline, pass through Ceylon or today's Sri Lanka, eventually go to Madras or Chennai in the southeast and Calcutta or Kolkata in the northeast. Then they would come to Penang, Singapore, and eventually wind up in Sarawak and Kuching. Now, as I said, Calcutta and Madras were chief centers for the production of company paintings and company jewels. Might the necklace have been a souvenir from one of those places on one of their journeys? And would that put into question its assigned date? Because they were making these journeys later in the 19th century. And, or did they buy it, if they bought it, as an antique? As I said, they were produced through the end of the century. Now, we also know that Margaret sold the large diamond once she was back in London after 1880. Had she kept the necklace, if that was still in her possession at the time, or was that sold at the same time the diamond was sold with perhaps other jewels? If she owned the necklace up until her death in 1936, did it stay in the family after that? And is that how it arrived at the auction house in London in 2006? Or had it passed through other hands before then? The one thing we always know as a detective, that the more you search for answers, the more you come up with more questions. And I certainly have a lot more questions that I can't answer. Now, the final part of this story is the necklace's final journey onto my neck in Phoenix, Arizona. And that one was for the books. Although it was purchased in November 2006, the necklace didn't arrive in Phoenix until October 2007 in a giant 100-pound wooden crate. It was a whatever can go wrong, did go wrong saga. And those of my friends who I know are online today, who lived through this saga with me, you will remember some of the gory details that unfortunately I don't have to go into today. But the first stumbling block that I'll just mention, because I alluded to at the very beginning of the talk, was that the necklace contained ivory. And in a way, that was a problem when they wrote up the description in the catalog. They said glazed panels. Glazed panels means they were just paintings underneath a dome of glass. And those paintings could have been on parchment. They could have been on regular paper. They could have been on anything. Now, of course, I know now more often these types of jewelry were done on ivory. But because of that, it evolved a whole lot of paperwork and a whole lot of problems between the auction house, with the CITES, with the Fish and Wild House, the fact that our files kept getting lost and misplaced and we had to start all over again. But again, they did not specifically say this at the beginning, and that complicated the whole process of getting it from London to Phoenix. But suffices to say, the auction house did their best to compensate us and made up for our bad experience. And actually, they even wound up changing some of their internal procedures based on what happened to us. And I will tell you, it was the very first auction that we ever participated in, and we learned our lesson, believe me. But the reams of all the letters, the emails, documents generated over that year are all part of my documentation of this globe-trotting piece of jewelry, and all part of its almost 200-year-old story. Which, by the way, I will say, I strongly encourage all collectors out there to document your collection well. And I do this for all my pieces, even for my costume jewelry. This is step one for appraisal, insurance, and inheritance reasons. It's very easy to do. I created a form. It's very low tech that I fill out for everything. I take a picture of what I have. I put in major information, and then I stuff every bit of information I have on any piece into little plastic sleeves with the original form that I fill out. And I put it into notebooks, and there they are. And anything I find in my future research gets added to those pages. And besides having a practical purpose, as I said, it's my own way of trying to pass on and resurrect all the lost stories, as well as my own story, to the next owner who has my piece. I am adding my layer to it, and hopefully the next custodian of that particular piece of jewelry will add theirs and pass it on. And I'm sure this need to document is also a result of my museum career, and it's in my DNA. So finally, the last stage of discovery, number 4, is related to the symbolism tied to a piece of jewelry. And of course, remember, as I said, that sentiment and emotion are very much a part of a jewel story. Now, Karen mentioned again in that quote at the beginning that jewelry sometimes changes over time. They're refashioned, they're taken apart, they're changed. You might think when you see this particular slide that something indeed has changed on the necklace. It arrived on a black ribbon tie. The black ribbon tie was very fragile, and I am not a museum. I am a collector, and I love my pieces, and I like to wear them, and it made it impossible to wear because the ribbon was so delicate. So I had the ribbon removed, and I added these gold chains, which belonged to my mother. I inherited from my mother after she passed away. So adding these chains to this necklace, which, added a whole nother layer of sentiment because they belong to my mother, and added sort of another historical component and an emotional component to the piece. Of course, I've saved the ribbons. You try to save as much as you can with the piece as you got it. And I'm not even sure those ribbons were original to the piece. To tell you the truth, I think that they might have been silk cords in looking at older pieces of Indian jewelry. It probably was a little bit different. And the other layer of sentiment for me was the necklace itself was actually a Valentine's Day present from my husband in 2006 that actually got delayed a year. And as I said, the necklace was once around the neck of a queen, Rane Margaret de Wint. And I joke because my husband's nickname for me is the Contessa, so now it lives on another woman of nobility. And since its arrival in my life, it has been worn and appreciated. And wherever the necklace goes next from here is anybody's guess, but it all makes for a great story. So there you have it.
Thank you, Jan. I mean, that was amazing. It was amazing. We have lots of questions.
Okay.
Just fascinating story. And I'm going to start with one. And then because I know in your documentation, you showed a brooch. You had sort of covered it up. Or what happened to that piece?
That's another interesting aside. The brooch came with the piece. It was purchased as a set. It's a more oval shape. I'd have to go back to the beginning, but it is more oval shape. I thought at first it was a clasp, but I looked on the back and I didn't see any evidence that there had been fasteners that would have attached it to whatever, a chain. It's also the Taj Mahal, so it's a repeat of the center disc. But yeah, so it was fashioned into a brooch at some point. And I haven't been able to figure it out. It wasn't, at first, someone said, well, maybe there were more than, 10 pieces on the necklace, but no, it's a different shape. So it's obviously was something else. It could have been a clasp. I just can't figure that out.
So there's a lot of questions around the auction. What attracted you to the piece in the first place, the history? How did you find it? Was there a bidding war? Tell us a little bit about that moment.
Yeah. Well, you know, Eric, because I get a lot of auction catalogs and they get sent to me, I'm always flipping through them, and I kind of stopped at this piece because it was so intriguing to me. First of all, the gold work is absolutely beautiful. I recognize that these were places in India. I've never been there. I don't have a connection to India, but I think maybe because of the imagery, again, I think because of an art historian, I'm attracted to pictures, to images. Um, and it was something I had never seen before. So I looked at it and I looked at the estimate of the price and I thought, well, what's this kind of, my husband and I looked at it and we said, well, this is kind of in the range of affordability, where lots of times you go through these auction catalogs and they're like way, you know, out of the stratosphere in terms of prices. And we just decided, okay, this is kind of a fun piece and it's unusual. I like finding things that are different. We'll go bid on it. And little did we know that we won it. I don't think anybody else bid on it actually. And it was before the finalization of the bidding process when the company called us and said, oh, by the way, it's on Ivory. Do you still want to bid on it? And they said, we'll help you take care of all the paperwork. Don't worry about it. We said, okay. And yeah, and that's how it happened. It was one of those things that, like anything else, a piece of jewelry or something, it just calls your name and you just need to have it.
And you know, the other thing I know that attracts me when there's a lot of information that seems to be left out, I'm always curious. Like, I love those pieces. Like, I don't know what this is about. This looks like a good dig. I love that. All right, so here's a couple more questions. How did the authorities know that the paintings were on Ivory? It's from Elise Carlin. And how much legally does an auction house have to divulge about the consignor?
Number one, they knew at the auction house that it was on Ivory from the very get-go, because you can just turn over, the piece is not closed back. The paintings are not closed back and you can see that it's Ivory. If you know what Ivory looks like with the graining and all of that. So they knew that. Whoever wrote the catalog entries sort of forgot to include it. I'm sorry, the second part of the question was?
That's great. So how much does an auction house have to disclose about the consignor?
They don't. And they didn't. I think I think it's an arrangement between the auction house and the seller. And particularly because this wasn't a quote major auction, I don't think they were very interested. And I mean, a lot of the pieces in the catalog were of lesser price point and not very important. Whereas obviously, you know, if it's a famous royal jewel or Elizabeth Taylor or something, you know, the name ups the price. I mean, we talk a lot about market value in things bought at auction, that sometimes it's not the inherent in value in the jewelry piece, but it's actually the person who owned it and the history of the piece that adds to the value of the piece, or the market, what the market will bear for it. But no, probably if I had called at the time and I didn't even think about it, now I don't even know if they could go back into their records from 2006 if they'd even want to, nor would they release that name to me. I can always give it a try. I just never thought to do it. I should.
Well, now, you know, the other thing is, I don't know that any of us knew about Sarawak. I certainly didn't.
No, I didn't know where it was.
But someone asked, what would that trip have been all the way to Malaysia from London? Like, how long would that have taken? Do we have any idea?
I have no idea, but I would say at least maybe a month on the sea, and it depends how long you'd stay at different ports of call. To break up the trip. I mean, I don't know. And in the book, it really didn't say when she talked about her trips back and forth between the two places. It never really said how long, but I would estimate at least a month, and they would have been on that boat long enough where her kids came down with cholera. You know, her first 3 children that passed away on the boat in the Red Sea, which is absolutely tragic.
Yeah, looks very rough. All right, let me see what else we have. Okay, a couple questions. When you pass this piece on to whomever, will you keep your mother's chains on it? Because I see that as you adding to the story of this.
Most likely I will. and it will hopefully, I will pass my jewelry, most likely will go down, passed on to family members. And then it will be their decision what to do. But it is now part of the piece. And as I said, I have the ribbons in the box that the piece came in, the original box made for it. So they'll all stay together, that and the brooch.
Do we know if there are any living descendants of the Queen of Sarawak? Do we know that?
Most likely, yes. Because as I said, she had 3 sons, all 3 of them were married. One of her sons became the, as I said, the 3rd Raja, and then there were children in that marriage. So yes, I mean, as I said, these pieces could have been passed down, but once the reign of the Rajas ended and the British took over Sarawak before it became its own country, you know, there are no more Ranes. They ended with the 3rd Raja.
Is Sarawak still like, is that the name? I mean, is it a different name? What is
No,
it?
it's the name. It's the name of the state. It's still, you know, on the island of Borneo, and it's part of Malaysia.
You could go. All right.
And by the way, I will say too, looking at this necklace, I meant to say, remember I talked about how you can eyeball gold. You know, you can see the difference in the color. My mom's chains are 14 karat. The piece that's, like I said, I think is 22 karat, maybe a little, you know, give or take. And you know, from a museum perspective, when people conserve paintings now, the philosophy is to keep the work that one does not so hidden that you can't tell the difference between the restoration work and the original work. So I kind of like, you know, the jeweler said, yeah, but they're not the same color gold. And I said, I know. And that's what's important, because it's clearly not part of the original piece. And I want it to remain not looking like the original piece.
Here's a question. Do you have suggestions who to pass down one's antique jewelry if you do not have children? Her niece does not like jewelry. Can you talk about donating it to museums? What?
That's a really good question, because as I'm saying, I mean, I don't have my own children. I have nieces, and you know, at some point we'll have that discussion. I don't know what they're going to want or not want. And the pieces have to be pretty special or fill in a gap in a museum collection. I think it's a lot of working to call people and say, this is what I have. Are you interested in it for the collection? I mean, it's a huge process. And I've yet to even, you know, get that far in my thinking. You know, as I said, very important pieces museums with major jewelry collections or building jewelry collections would love to have, but it has to be a really special piece and relate to the rest of the collection that they have. I would just say a lot of it is phone calling and networking and asking, you know, and if not, it goes to auction. You know, it's up to, as I said, whoever gets it after me, they can either keep it or they can choose to sell it at auction. But I've done my bit in at least giving them as much information as I can on the piece, and even to the point of what I paid for it, so they know kind of, you know, what it was worth at the time that it was purchased. So, you know.
So to that point, someone asked, all right, so one thing, someone wants to see that sheet you do, if you can kind of go back to that, your sheet about how you document.
Whoops.
And then someone asked about like price, is it 4 or 5, you know, just to kind of give a range, 4 figures, 5 figures, is it? So if you so are inclined, that was a question.
Which was the form? Okay.
You may have to share screen again.
Yeah, I will. I'm just going to find it. Can you see? There we go. What was that, the question while I was looking?
Well, here's,
I,
you don't have to, just came up on the chat.
yeah, I left out the price just because as a museum person, I really don't like talking about price or divulging it. So, but it was reasonable. I mean, for what it is, it was more than reasonable. Let's put it that way. And because nobody else wanted it, it was even more reasonable.
Why was it shipped in a 100-pound box?
That's a very good question that I've never really been able to answer, but part of it had to do with the whole Murphy's Law situation with getting it from London to Phoenix. Somehow, the company that they hired to handle the shipping of it and all the paperwork didn't quite understand that it easily could have been shipped in a little small cardboard. I mean, I worked in museums my whole career, and I've had valuable works of art arrive in, crates that were much smaller. And I've shipped jewelry, and my friends who have antique jewelry businesses in London have sent it in a little FedEx box. I mean, we will never understand. They shipped it, they carted it, they trucked it from New York to Phoenix. I mean, it was the most insane thing we had ever seen. And of course, that kept adding to the price that they kept charging us, which, as I said, the auction house compensated us for it. They were horrified when all of this came to light, and they could not understand how this possibly could have happened. But I don't know. But when you're buying a necklace and a little brooch and you get this giant wooden crate at your front door, it's kind of an amazing thing to have happen.
All right, so I'm going to get two more questions.
Okay.
All right, one, someone asked, Cheryl, I'm going to look for the question. Could the two things, but the ivory, the paintings and the gold, been done at different times?
It could have, but in looking at other similar jewels that are also very well documented in museum collections, I think that in the gold work, I think they're pretty much done at the same time.
And were they, yeah, okay, so probably, I think she was thinking, could the paintings be older? But you're sort of thinking same.
No, I'm thinking the piece was all done at the same time.
And one more question. Have you ever looked at your necklace next to a Grand Tour necklace of the same style?
You mean an Italian one? Italian Grand Tour necklace? Have I looked at it next to? I have actually a lot of Grand Tour. I have a lot of micro mosaic jewelry that I've collected, but I don't know what putting them together would tell me. I'm not real sure.
Well, just
unless the gold work, the type of yeah, I think if they're referring to the type of gold work, I really do think this is Indian and not Italian.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I'll let Cheryl. Okay, just another. All right, we've had a great, Jan, this was fantastic. I think we learned a lot. I'm not even going to be able to look at my jewelry in the same way without thinking sort of through the steps that you taught us. And also about documentation, I think is so important. But this was like a really great journey. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. We'll hope you'll join us for some other events that we're planning over the next few months. We have a jewelry geography tour of the Nomad Flatiron neighborhood coming up. We have The Scoop, which is our Moth Meets Antiques Roadshow storytelling series. If you have a jewelry story, and this is like a personal story, please reach out. And we have some other surprises coming up. So sign up for our newsletter if you're not on our email list, and we send out invites. You can find that on our website, thejewelrylibrary.com. And we also have post on our events on Instagram at the Jewelry Library. So stay safe, everybody. Stay warm. If you're on the East Coast, it's single digits, and have a really good night. And thank you, Jan, again.
Thank you, Karen.
So good.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.